Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'm going to go ahead and get started. For those of you that have not attended one of our webinar series, I'm Shane Gebauer, the General Manager of Brushy Mountain Bee Farm. I'd like to welcome you. The plan tonight is to talk for about 40 or so minutes, plus or minus, depending how things go, and then have some time at the end for some questions. And some of you have already been sending in your questions. And the way I handle questions is generally I'll just read the question so that you all can hear it, and then just verbally reply as opposed to trying to type an answer and send it all out to you. It's easier for me just to answer it verbally. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Tonight's topic is caring for a new colony. For those of you that have attended previous webinars, some of this information will sound familiar to you, but hopefully this will be a consolidated message session where we talk about caring for a new colony. And this could be a colony that was either established through a package of bees or a nucleus hive, or I suppose even perhaps catching a swarm. Some of the things that you'll need to consider your first year. So I'm assuming that you've either started your package, your new colony, or nuke, whatever the case may be, sometime in the past few months, or perhaps will be in the next week or so to get that colony up and running this year. The outline for this evening is I'm planning on picking up from after the queen's been released. Again, this is assuming that you've started with a package of bees. So I'm assuming you've got that package in there, you've installed that queen cage, you've gone back to that colony, and your queen has been released. In the case of a nucleus hive or a swarm, you've installed those bees, and I'm picking up basically from that point. So we'll go back and check to make sure that queen is there. We'll cover feeding. There's already been several questions about feeding. We'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about inspections, when, for what are you looking for. The long and the short for inspections is you should never go into a hive just for the sake of going into a hive. You should always have a purpose in mind, a goal in mind for that inspection. And so you should always have that thought out before you open up your hive so that you know what you're looking for, what your goal is, and why you're doing the inspection. We're going to talk about growing the hive. Of course, whenever you start a colony, it's relatively weak. So we're going to be talking about how to grow that hive and get it to the point where it can survive winter. We'll talk real briefly about harvesting and fall management, but I'll give you a little hint that I'll probably be doing a fall management harvesting webinar later on in the season as that time nears. I just want to double check something. Okay. Okay. So first off, let's talk about feeding. It's always a good idea to reduce your entrance when feeding. The reason for this is your colony is relatively weak. Depending on where you are, and this is true whether you're feeding in spring or fall, depending on what is flowering in the environment where you have your colony, other bees may find your feeder more enticing than what's available out in nature. Or maybe there isn't anything available out there. We're in what we call a nectar dearth. There's nothing flowering. We're in sufficient quantities of flowers for them to get sufficient nectar to provide for their own colony. So robbing can become an issue, and that's why you reduce your entrance so that this weak colony that you've started and you're caring for has a smaller entrance to defend against these robbing bees. A robbing frenzy, if you've never seen one, is really quite a spectacle. And once it starts, it's rather difficult to stop because what's happened are all these forager bees from various colonies have been trained to to key in on your colony, and they're trained to know that there is a food source there. And if there's a dearth going on, they're looking for anything and everything they can get. So they can really do a tremendous amount of damage to a new colony if you don't have that reducer or that entrance reduced. How long do you feed them? The short answer is you feed them until they don't take it anymore. So right now, for example, I've got actually a picture of a colony that I just started last week. I had a feeder on it. They did not touch or took very little of the corn syrup that I had on that colony. And the reason for that is that we have right now our tulip poplar in full bloom, and that's a good nectar source. And actually locust is blooming now as well, and those are good nectar sources for colonies. And the thing that's sort of funny about honeybees is they really prefer the good stuff, and nature provides them the good stuff. They would much rather forage on those flowers than visit the feeder that's right at their entrance to their hive. And so right now you could be feeding your colony and they might not take anything. And also right about now is when we start getting phone calls from people saying, my bees are going to starve, they're not consuming their food. Well, it may be that they just don't want, no offense folks, but they may not want what you're giving them. And the simple reason for that is there's something better out in nature. So feed it until they don't take it anymore. Now, there's a couple of qualifiers here that... and I was talking about this with one of the beekeepers that works here, and telling them some stories that I've heard from the past. That a package that was started got up and running, tremendous bloom going on, but there was an extended period of rain. And actually, in where we are in North Carolina, we've had a tremendous period of rain. A few days here and there, that like today, that's been fairly nice. But otherwise, it's been pretty miserable weather. The reason I mention this is because those colonies that have just started have not built up a sufficient food reserve to carry them through those periods of really lousy weather. And so if you started a colony this year and they're not taking your syrup and you think, okay, they're fine, you pull your feeder and now you get a week of bad weather, they could exhaust their food reserves and either starve to death in worst case scenario or at least be weakened as a result. So I've sort of skipped ahead down to this bottom point here, which is be mindful of your weather. And this is true even if you have honey supers on. So this third point is that you should stop feeding once you put honey supers on, because the last thing you want as a beekeeper, especially if these are new colonies that you're just started, you're brand new this year, you're looking so forward to your first jar of honey that will be the best honey you've ever tasted in your life. The last thing you want is to be feeding your colony when you put on your first honey super. And the reason being, they will simply take your sugar water or corn syrup, whatever it is you're feeding them, and store it in your honey super. And when you go to harvest, you will be harvesting corn syrup or sugar water, not honey. And so that would be quite a disappointment if this is your first year and you're just getting started. So stop feeding once you put on your honey supers. But again, I mentioned this last point, be mindful of your weather. As beekeepers, you are expected that you will earn your degree in meteorology. You're also expected that you will earn a degree in botany so that you can identify what's flowering and when, and is it good for bees, for nectar, pollen, what have you. So beekeeping is really a multifaceted thing, and you do become very familiar with your surroundings, both weather and what's blooming. Now, jumping back up here to the second point, feed until they don't take it anymore. One of the questions that we get often with people starting colonies is, what sort of medications do I need to apply to this colony? And generally I say you don't need to do anything because they're just getting started. But the one thing that you may want to consider is either Honeybee Healthy or Fumagillin B. Honeybee Healthy is a food stimulant that helps sort of, it's basically a multivitamin, if you will, that promotes good bee health. Fumagillin B is effective against treating nosema. Now, these bees have been, in the case of a package, they may be confined to that package. Depending on what sort of weather you have, they may not be able to get out on cleansing flights, and so it's always a good idea to sort of give them something that can help with nosema. And both Honeybee Healthy, while unofficially, or rather, I should say, rather officially, does not treat for nosema, there's a lot of good information out there that says that Honeybee Healthy is effective against nosema, as well as Appa Herb, which is new to us this year, and we do have that in stock now. So that hopefully addresses some of the basics of feeding. Now, some of the questions that came in while we were waiting to get started is pollen patties. Should you feed pollen patties? If you're starting a colony right now, pretty much no matter where you are, I would say a pollen patty is a waste of your time and money. Because, again, for example, here in North Carolina, we've got tulip poplar, we've got locust, we've got poison ivy. Actually, is really good. I've got a big old vine growing up a tree outside my house, and it was roaring on Sunday with bees because the poison ivy is blooming, and that's a good pollen source for them. So generally speaking, this time of year, they're not going to touch that patty. They're going to go for the au naturel stuff. They're going to go for what's nature providing them, and it's, again, better than what you're going to provide for them. So pollen patties this time of year probably would be a waste of money. If you happen to have bought some, not a big deal. You can either keep them wrapped up tight in your fridge or freezer, and you can feed it to them this fall or save them for next spring. Also a question, someone asked about brown sugar. I don't recommend making sugar syrup out of brown sugar. There's a lot of impurities in the sugar that are not very beneficial for honeybees, and so it could create some problems. If you happen to have some other colonies that maybe overwintered, or you've got some frames of honey that you saved from last year, you can certainly feed that to your new colony as long as you know the source of that honey. I don't recommend buying honey from someone and feeding that because you could transmit diseases. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about inspection. Basically, again, we're picking up your queen's been released. So you've installed your package, you waited a week, you went back, and your queen was released, you closed up your hive again, and now that's where we're picking up. So you need to go back and you need to check to make sure your queen is present and laying. Someone at the very beginning said, what are some tricks? What are some tips on finding my queen? And right in front of you is the best tip I can give you, which is don't actually look for her, look for signs that she is there. And let me get my highlighter here. All of these right here, that's an egg. That's an egg. There's an egg. This is actually a larva that's probably maybe 2 days old, a day or two old. Here's an egg. Here's an egg. But notice the orientation of these eggs. They're way down at the bottom. Let's find, here's one. It's all the way down at the bottom of the cell. Here's a good one. All the way down at the bottom of the cell, and it's standing upright, and it's glued right down there in the center of the cell, all the way down at the bottom. This is the best evidence, outside of actually seeing the queen, this is the best evidence that your colony is queen right. In other words, the queen is present, she's laying, things are going well. And so my answer to tips and tricks to finding the queen is I generally don't spend a whole lot of time looking for her. That doesn't answer the question really, but the point is you don't necessarily need to see her to know that she's present. Now, of course, it always is nice to know and see her there. If you've got a visual on her, you know she's present then, there's absolutely no question. but it can be very difficult. I went through 2 packages that I installed last week, and frankly, they were packages that someone failed to pick up. They were really weak packages. They sat around too long, and I popped them in a hive. They were 3-pound packages, probably down to maybe 2 pounds at best. So not a whole lot of bees. And it took me 2 passes through the colony to actually find the queen. And I was actually on a mission to find her because I wanted to get some pictures. It can be very difficult, even in a colony that doesn't have a lot of bees, to find the queen. So this is what you're looking for. Now, this sort of inspection, to check to make sure your queen is present and laying, I would wait 1 week after you have checked to make sure that the queen was actually released. Now, if you installed a package, or rather a nuke, or caught a swarm, from the time you've installed those bees, you can wait a week to go in and look for these eggs. These can be incredibly difficult to see. There's no question about it. But the best way is sort of just, I'm really zoomed in on the frame here, but imagine I'm holding this frame in front of me, and I've got the sunlight coming over my shoulder, shining down into these cells. That's your best bet to seeing these eggs. You want that light shining down in there. They're really difficult to see, but once you start to see them, it becomes easier. You know what to look for. But you want to see these. And again, you're doing this inspection 1 week after you've checked to make sure your queen's been released or you've installed your nuke or swarm. And the reason why you want to wait a week is sometimes that queen, even though they come mated in the pack with packaged bees, it sometimes takes her a while to get out and establish. Maybe you're putting her, that package or a nuke on brand new comb, and so it takes the bees a little bit to draw out some comb before she can lay in there, and that might take some time for that all to happen. So you want to wait about a week before you go back in there. And you don't want to, now you're all proud parents, right? I understand that. You know, it's sort of like after my son was born, you know, I went into his room, it seemed like every hour when he was sleeping, or even more often than that, just to make sure everything was okay, right? Well, you're new parents, you're beekeepers now, you want to check on all your kids, and so you want to go to that hive and crack the lid and look in and make sure everything's going well, but you really want to give them some space. You don't want to disrupt what they're doing. Every time you go in to inspect a hive, you're actually setting them back in terms of the progress that they're making. You're disrupting the natural function of what's going on and interrupting what they're doing, and that delays their growth. So you don't want to go in constantly. So install your package, install your nuke, you check to make sure your queen's been released, and then wait a week after that to go in and look for this sort of stuff. Look for eggs to make sure that she's laying. Now, I throw this next slide out there to look at, because this is a case where this is not a good thing. And unfortunately, this photo isn't quite as good as my previous, but you can see an egg here, you can see an egg over here, you can see a couple of eggs all shriveled up down in here. This is a bad situation. The eggs are not glued right in the center, standing up on end. They're sort of stuck on the sides. There's multiple eggs. This is a sign of a laying worker. Now, it takes a while for a laying worker to develop. I don't expect y'all to experience this, but I wanted to point this out because you need to see a good quality egg. In other words, just one egg in the center of the cell standing upright, as opposed to this situation where you're seeing multiple eggs scattered throughout, maybe even stuck, some of them might be stuck up onto the sides of the cells. That does not mean your colony is queen right. It means you've got other problems. So that's why I point that out here, just so that you're aware of the differences. Now let's talk a little bit about population dynamics of a package, and then I'll also talk a little bit about population dynamics of a nucleus hive. Generally speaking, this time of year, during the growing season, the average bee lives 4 to 6 weeks. It's not a whole lot of time. Now, let's say that you've installed that package today. that queen is going to be caged for about a week. Generally speaking, it's usually less than that, but let's just say a week. She's caged for a week. So she's in there for a week. Now, let's think back to our bee biology. I'm sure this is all right there on the tips of your tongues. The worker takes on average 21 days from the time an egg is laid to the time an adult worker emerges from a cell. So that's 3 weeks, plus the 1 week that the queen is caged. We're up to 4 weeks already before any new bees are emerging into that colony. And yet, look at this first line, that the average bee lives 4 to 6 weeks. So that's going to result in quite a decline in population. And it's important to know this, because when you put your bees in there, you think, whoa, look at all those bees. This is fantastic. This is wonderful. And then you go back maybe a week or two later, and you're like, whoa, where are all my bees? They're gone. Well, it could be just this natural decline in the population from that package, because you're getting this natural mortality of bees dying off. Now, fortunately, what happens here is, in theory, this package could collapse before it even grows. Well, fortunately, theory doesn't always work out in practice, because what happens is a lot of the bees that are installed with that package immediately start doing housekeeping work. And house bees, they generally live longer than, because it's the wear and tear on the foraging that really shortens their lives. So when a bee goes when a bee that's installed into a hive from a package starts taking on house responsibilities, their lifespan increases slightly, because they're doing that less rigorous, less strenuous work. So the average bee of a package actually lives beyond that 4-week mark, so that it does actually begin, the colony can grow before it collapses. Now, what may happen as a result is that they may begin to produce either queen cups or even queen cells. Because now, let me just, before I actually continue, let me explain this picture over here, because it's sort of an awkward angle. This is actually my top bar. I didn't have someone out there to help hold the frame while I was taking the picture, so I had to stand it up on its top bar so it could stand upright. So we're actually sort of looking from the top bars here. We're looking down into these cells right here. And now these are cell cups. These are queen cups. And I point these out because in almost every single colony you go into, you will find queen cups. And it's important to know the difference between queen cups, which is what these are. These are queen cups, versus queen cells, which are what these are. Now, this frame is, in fact, the bottom bar is down here and the top bar is up here. So this is sort of a more natural orientation, if you will. So these are queen cells. This is a sign, of course, that a queen's being raised in that colony. These are not necessarily a sign that a new queen's being raised in that colony. But they like to produce these queen cups, have them on hand, just in case. So as your package naturally declines, you may see the formation of queen cups. It's important to note, and you can see it a little bit here, is that inside these cells, especially in this one, you can see nothing. There is no egg. There is no larva. So all they've done is built that cup, but they're not utilizing it, as opposed to over here where they have actually constructed queen cells. Now, again, as your population declines, what may happen, now we're going to sort of give these bees a little bit of human emotion and thought process, but what's happening is your population's declining, and these bees may say, whoa, our queen's failing, our population's declining, let's try and supersede her. Because the colony's collapsing, they may see that queen or perceived collapse of a colony. they may say the queen's failing and try and supersede her. So it doesn't happen all the time, but I have seen and heard of cases where they produce supersedure cells in attempts to try and raise out a new queen because of the natural decline in the colony. It doesn't happen too frequently, but it does happen. So that's why I bring it up. All right. Natural population dynamic of a nuke. Generally speaking, a nuke is going to be a smaller population of bees compared to a package. However, the queen is in there and laying from day one. So a colony started with a nuke is only going to continue to grow because you've got frames that have brood in all stages. You've got eggs, you've got larvae, you've got capped brood, you've got honey, you've got pollen for that colony to continue to grow. And so basically you install a nuke, and conceivably before you even close it up, new bees could be emerging from the capped brood. So this colony is only going to continue to grow over time, but it has fewer bees to start. Now, if you were to start a nuke and a package on the same day, that nuke would grow much faster than that package. But again, now in this case, you don't know where your queen is. You don't know whether you've transferred her to the box. In fact, one of the questions that came in before I got started was someone that had a nuke and they had queen cells in that nuke. So there could be some problems with nukes that make them more difficult for people to get started, despite the fact that they do grow more rapidly. All right. Now, so we've talked about feeding. We've talked about that initial inspection to make sure your queen's out and she's laying. Let's talk about adding layers, adding stories. You may hear them called stories, layers, what have you. When do you add them? Basically, my rule of thumb is, and let me back up. I'm assuming that you're all starting with brand new frames and foundation. Things change a little bit if you're using comb from drawn comb from another colony, or perhaps a colony that died out and now you're using that comb in this colony. My rule of thumb is you add a new layer, a new story, whether it be a brood chamber or a honey super. It all depends on what stage the package, the colony is at, when all but 2 of the outer frames are being worked. And now in this case, I've got a 10-frame hive, and if you've got an 8-frame hive, then you would wait until 6 of these inner frames were being worked. In this case, I've got 8 of these inner frames being worked. And now this right here, you can see this foundation being drawn out. The other side of this frame, which I don't have a picture of, is pretty much completely drawn out. They're actually putting nectar and pollen in there. You can actually, if you look real close, you can see some dark spots coming through the foundation, which is actually where you can actually see through the foundation to the other side of the frame where they've stored pollen. And you can see a couple, it's sort of difficult, but there's some other spots here as well. So now this is what I mean by a frame being worked. One side is almost completely drawn out. They're utilizing it for storage, whether it be brood, nectar, pollen, whatever. This side of the frame is being drawn out. You can see it sort of extending over here, and you can't really see it, but there is some whitish wax over on this side as well, where you can see they've just begun adding new wax or resculpting the existing foundation to start to pull those cells out. So I consider this frame being worked. And what I do at this point, again, assuming brand new equipment, is I take this frame out, which is this frame right here, and I would take this frame out, okay? And I'm going to try and show this because this is a question I always get. So I'm going to pull this frame out, okay, which is sort of what I'm doing with this one. I'm going to take this frame right here, my very outer one, and move it to this position right here. Now this frame I take and move to this position right here. So basically what I'm doing is I'm taking this very outer frame and jumping it in one position. And the reason why I'm doing that is because bees, whether you've got 8 frame or 10 frame, bees like to move up. And if you give them too much space vertically, in other words, if I just throw 2 boxes on top of one another here, they're just going to go up into those upper boxes, and they're not going to draw out these outer frames. But they are going to need those outer frames to overwinter on, because that's where they'll put honey. That's where they'll put some pollen. So they'll need all these frames drawn out. And if you don't force them out, or you don't force them to draw out all the frames, all of these frames in the box, then they may not have adequate storage space to go into winter. So by taking this frame and jumping it in one position, I'm moving it closer to the brood nest. I'm not disrupting it. I'm not taking that frame and putting it right here between my brood nest and dividing it in half. That's not good. All I'm doing is moving it in one position, so it'll be worked like this. And this is true of whether you're using wood frames like these or if you're using plastic frames, whatever type of foundation, it doesn't matter. Now, so I'll I'll move these frames around, then I'll add my next story. I'll do the same thing. In this case, it's a 10 frame hive. I'll wait until 8 frames are being worked. I'll take those 2 outer ones, jump them in one position, and I'm adding my next story. This is a deep box. I'm going to probably put a medium on top of this. I'm sort of liking a 1.5 story configuration where I'm located in this yard. So I'll probably put a medium on top of this, wait until 8 frames are being worked, jump the 2 outer ones in, and put that medium on top. Once that medium has those 8 frames, I'll do the same thing. Then I'll be ready to add a honey super, at which point I will stop feeding. Okay, you can't see it, but sort of up outside of the picture frame here is my entrance feeder. So I'll do that with my medium brood chamber. I'll wait until they've got those 8 out of 10 worked, and then I'm ready to add a honey super. Now, here's the thing. I'm working with brand new equipment here, brand new frames, brand new foundation. If you're putting on your first honey super and it's brand new equipment like this, do not put on a queen excluder. A queen excluder will be sufficient to prevent the bees from going up into that honey super to begin to draw out the wax. Leave that queen excluder off to begin with. Let them go up in there. You don't have to wait until they've got 8 out of the 10 frames or 6 out of the 8, whatever the case may be. But let them go up there and begin to draw comb. Let them go up there, begin to store nectar. Maybe even the queen will go up into that honey super and begin to lay. That's okay. It's not going to be the end of the world. Once they've begun to do that, once they're even working just a couple of frames here in the center, then you can go back in and slip your queen excluder in between your brood chamber and your honey super. Because now they've got enough of these frames being worked that they'll pass through that queen excluder, or maybe even the queen went up there and laid a couple of eggs, and bees very, very, very rarely neglect brood. So they'll pass right through that queen excluder to tend to the brood. That brood, after 21 days, will emerge out, and now they'll store honey in those cells, and that's just fine. Just make sure when you slip that queen excluder in place that you are not trapping your queen in your honey super. Okay? So this sort of inspection to determine when to add another layer, of course, this is what I'm using as my cue to add another layer, but I go into my hive. In this case, I'll probably let this one, once, this one's been in for two weeks, and I'm ready to add my next one, but the population, again, is beginning to crash here, so it'll take longer for the next box to reach this same state of 8 frames. So I'll probably wait another 2 weeks before I'll check it, but it'll probably be about another 3 or so before I actually add another story. So hopefully that makes sense and answers the question of sort of when to add additional layers or stories, as they're often referred to. All right, real quick, a little bit of harvesting. Generally speaking, we tell people that if you're starting a new colony, don't expect to get any honey off of that colony the first year. Because if I just jump back up to this frame, it takes 7 pounds of honey to produce 1 pound of wax. And look at all the wax. Figure all these frames have to be drawn with wax. Then the next layer has to be drawn with wax. And then in addition to that, they actually have to store, depending on where you're located, 60 to 80 pounds worth of honey to overwinter on. That's what they need to overwinter on. And here are some real general guidelines. It depends on how full they are, etc. But a medium frame usually holds about 6 pounds of honey, and the deep holds, 8 to 10 pounds. So you can get a sense of, okay, I've got 4 deeps full of honey in the bottom. So 4 that, and it's figure 8 pounds. So you've got 32 pounds of honey there. And, maybe you've got a couple of mediums, and so you're starting to approach the 60-pound mark. You can do some rough calculations that way, but you want about 60 to 80 pounds of honey for overwintering purposes. So you're only going to harvest if there's sufficient winter reserves, or if you're willing to feed, and you can feed sugar water, corn syrup, whatever you prefer. And again, your first year, you may not get any honey at all. But you probably will. Enough to at least get that first premium grade, best honey in the world you've ever tasted jar off your colony your first year. Let's talk a little bit about fall management of your colony. This opens up a whole suite of questions about medications and things like that. And I'll probably do a webinar again later on in the year once it gets closer to medication time. But let's just think about some basics here. Again, I go back to the point that the average bee during the growing season lives 4 to 6 weeks. Winter bees, your colony goes dormant, goes broodless in most areas. Your queen shuts down or slows production, egg-laying production. And so those bees that are going through winter, you're sort of expecting them to live 4 to 6 months. So the only way your colony is going to make it through winter is if you have healthy bees going into winter that will be able to survive that 4 to 6 months. If you don't have healthy bees, you could potentially have problems. And one of the things that you need to consider, of course, varroa mites, and I've got some pictures just in case people haven't seen any pictures of varroa before. Varroa mite vectors not only weakens the bee all by itself, but it also vectors viruses. It transmits viruses like a mosquito can transmit malaria. And these viruses remain after the varroa is gone. So what that means is you have to have 2 to 3 generations of bees being reared in your colony after you've treated them. Now, notice I'm not saying what to treat with, because that's really a management decision. That's something that you as beekeepers will need to decide, whether you want to use the mite strips, whether you want to try and go more natural with IPM techniques, things like that. If you can use IPM, which is next week's topic, to keep your mite population low, it may be that you don't need to treat anything, that your IPM altogether keeps your mite levels below the threshold, and you're going to have healthy bees regardless of what you do in the fall, because you've done such a wonderful job during the growing season. But you need to have healthy bees going into winter. And one of the ways to do that is if you're using some sort of treatment, whether it be Mite-Away 2, Apolife VAR, the mite strips, you need to do it early enough so that you get those 2 to 3 generations post-treatment. So we're looking at, again, depending on where you are, you're looking at treating probably in August sometime, late August, mid to late August, to get those 2 to 3 generations after you've treated. Only healthy bees will survive, so you need to make sure they're healthy. The other thing you want to consider is nosema. that if you're feeding, it's easy enough to mix in a little Fumagillin B or Honeybee Healthy, or you can apply the Appa herb, which is natural ingredients mixed with corn syrup and trickled onto the bees. But that's something you want to consider. These are your two things that you want to consider. And I'm not going to get into specifics about what to treat with and how to do that. That's a whole nother webinar. But I want you to be aware so that this is in the back of your minds as we go through summer, that you need to have healthy bees going into winter. There's lots of ways to achieve that. But you need to keep this in the back of your mind so that you can start planning now. Because maybe you want to use that new powdered sugar blower that we just got and use powdered sugar. Maybe you don't want to mess with that. Maybe you don't want to use drone trapping. Maybe you just want to use Mitaway 2, which is formic acid or Appolife R, and do that in August. But you need to think about it now so you can plan accordingly. And that's why I bring it up. Here are varroa mites. Lots and lots of varroa mites. Really bad infestation. The one thing that this slide does not do for us, it shows us what they look like. Here's looks like an immature that got hauled out that never finished maturing in the cell. Here's another one. The one thing that this does not do for us is sort of put these in scale. So here's what they look like. They look sort of like a tick. Here's what it's out of focus. I apologize, but we're only using this for scale purposes. So, of course, here's your adult worker, and here's a varroa. And here's a varroa. So that puts it in scale for you, and you can see them with the naked eye, so you know what to look for. This is a bad sign. This is deformed wing virus. It's a sign of a heavy varroa infestation, and not surprising, there's one. There's one, and I actually cropped this photo. There's other bees in the photo that have varroa on them. And this is also from the same hive that had all of these on the sticky board. So bad infestation of varroa. Oh, that brings us to the end. So that took 43 minutes. Let me expand my questions here, and I'll try and get to them all. I've been successful in previous weeks, and hopefully I can today. When should I remove 1-to-1 sugar water? Hopefully, let me just drag this out just a little bit more so I can see people's names. Hopefully, Lyle, I've answered that question. If not, let me know. Okay. When should we requeen a package of bees? That's a good question. Package of bees. A queen that has overwintered twice is 3 times more likely to swarm than a queen that has not overwintered that many times. So the queens that come with your package, I would wait until, let's say you install a package this year, I would wait until next year to requeen that colony. I used to say that requeening your colony every other year is sufficient until I found out about, that 3 times more likely to swarm fact. I always thought that it was the queen producers that are saying requeen annually, requeen annually. But I have switched to trying to requeen on an annual basis. Now, most people will tell you the best time to requeen is in fall because you'll get your best quality queens. And that may be true, but trying to find a queen, because now you actually do have to find her. You cannot leave a queen. You cannot leave a queen in a colony and stick a new queen in there and expect that to go well. So you need to find your old queen, pinch her off, and install the new one. And in August, it may be very difficult to find that old queen. I generally, and this is personal preference, there's a lot of people out there that disagree with me on this. And frankly, I'll tell you, they're probably right. But for convenience purposes, I generally requeen in late April, because then your queen producers have sufficient drones in the area for your queens to mate with, so you'll get a good quality mating. But your colony is not yet so strong that it makes it difficult to find the queen. So it's sort of balancing those two things. And it's really sort of the drone population and weather parameters that say that the reason why people say wait until later in the year to get your queens for requeening, because you'll have more drones in the environment, you'll have better weather for the queens to get out there and mate with them. And for that reason, I don't usually get queens very early in the year, like March, because sometimes there aren't sufficient drones. Sometimes the weather could be cold and rainy and nasty, and your queens can't get out there and mate. That's why I wait until about the end of April. But again, there's a lot of people that disagree with me on that. So hopefully that answers your question, Joan. When trapping bees out of a chimney, how long should you leave a new hive in place before moving and cleaning out the chimney to cap? Well, you'll never get the queen out unless you can actually access the comb. So you'll always have bees coming and going, brood emerging. It could be quite a long thing. You're just hoping to get most of the foragers if you can't actually get in there. And I would say probably, maybe for 2-3 days. But you'll still have a lot of bees after that because presumably you've got brood in there and eggs in there that could continue to mature. So you might get brood emerging, a worker's cap for 12 days. So you could see new bees coming into that colony for 12 days after you've restricted their ability to re-enter. Let's see. This person bought some Bee Boost, which is a brood stimulant, and wow, does it work? Wall-to-wall laying and going on now. I don't want to. Alan, there's no doubt that stimulates brood production. My concern with that product is the stress that it may cause on the colony, because now you're working them. I mean, you are working that colony, you're working the queen, you're really pushing them to stimulate that brood production. And I have heard, of course, this is, second, third-hand information. I haven't actually tested that product myself, so take this with a grain of salt. I have heard of people after a couple of applications of it. Now, my understanding is the label says use it once, wait before reapplying. But, beekeepers, they rarely, anyone, they rarely, especially guys, they never read instructions unless there's a picture. That these people have put it on a couple of times and basically worked the colony to death, so to speak, where it collapsed. So just be careful. I guess that's my word of advice. Just be careful. Let's see. Okay, so here's a new beekeeper that just bought 2 full hives 1 month ago. So these are not packages, these are not nukes, these are hives, as I'm understanding it. One's already swarmed, recaptured, rehived. Just let everything go as is. What I would do is, hopefully you've already added additional stories to that hive, because these are active colonies that are going. You can try putting in brand new foundation. What that does is sort of create gaps because the comb's not drawn out, so there's a bigger gap in there. That helps with ventilation. That sometimes helps, and it also gives them space. I actually went through some colonies of mine this past weekend and got very concerned because some of the frames are just plugged with pollen. So they're becoming pollen bound. And so I've taken some of those frames out and put in that case, I just put in drawn comb, but it gives them space, gives that queen room to lay. If I left those full frames in there, it restricts the space that she's got to lay, and that could induce swarming. So you need to check for that. Make sure that she's got plenty of space. Add additional stories if necessary. You can give them empty frames, new foundation to work on. That can help. And I would start with that. The frames that you pull out, always good to have drawn comb on hand. You can freeze it to kill off any wax moth eggs that may be in there. and then take it out of a freezer and store it in a plastic bag. It helps if you have to catch a swarm, if you want to make a split. It's always good to have drawn comb on hand. Beekeeper friend of mine says drawn comb is money in the bank. Let's see. Put a reducer on when I installed a nuke, but there seems to be a traffic jam at the entrance, so I took it off. Should I keep it on anyway? You just keep a close watch on it. Generally speaking, as much as I harped on robbing, this time of year I don't see a whole lot of it because pretty much everywhere people live, this time of year there's a pretty good nectar flow going on. And so they'd much rather take the easy route, which is going to a flower to get nectar, than doing battle with the hive that's trying to protect their resources. So you'll probably be okay to leave it off, but just be very, very careful. Let's see. So I'm just sort of reading through the question here, finding out what's going on, so I can. It's a lengthy one. I just want to summarize it. Is it okay to? Okay. So this person got. I think they said that they were four packages. 3 queens were released. Now these queens were in plastic queen cages, which is a little bit different than a wooden queen cage, which I've shown in previous webinars. And the plastic cage has a little cap that goes over where the candy is. So instead of a cork, it's got a cap. And this person forgot to remove one of those caps. There's much worse things that could happen. Once the person's realized it, they replace the queen. Will this be okay? I would say at this point you could probably poke a hole, and also the follow-up is it okay in these circumstances to puncture the candy cork to release the queen manually? I might not release her manually, although it'd probably be safe to do it at this point because the queens have been in there a week, I believe it states here. So you probably would be okay to release her manually, but what I would do is puncture a hole, but not make it big enough so that she can walk out or a worker can walk in there, but big enough that basically in a day or so she's going to be out. The other thing you can do is when you pull that cage out, don't shake the bees, the worker bees that are on that cage off immediately. Look at them. See what's going on. Are they biting at that cage, or are they trying to feed the queen that's on the inside? If they're biting at it, that's a sign they haven't accepted her yet. If they're trying to tend to her, that's a good sign. So I would be more apt to direct release her, manually release her, if I saw them trying to tend to her as opposed to trying to bite at her. Hopefully that answers your question. How long till a bee starves? Huh. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. It depends. I guess if it had a full stomach, it would be longer. I can tell you that. I would probably give it, if you're forcing me, James, to give you a time frame, I would say that maybe 4 days. If you're forcing me, I have no idea. But I mean, that could be completely way off. I'm sorry, I just don't know. But that's a good question. I'm going to do a little research on that. Okay, went from thoughts of letting a beekeeper put hives on property, having 3 hives with supers all at once, reading lots of books, have bought lots. So, Cindy, not a question in here, but so I assume you're keeping the hives yourself, which is great. When you say stop feeding after you put a super on, do you mean a second hive body? No. I distinguish a hive body from a super as follows. A hive body basically, to me, is a brood chamber. So there are a lot of people out there, myself included, that use a medium box, which most people use as honey supers, but people, again, including myself, use those also as brood chambers. So I distinguish that box as a brood chamber or high body, one and the same, from a honey super based on its position. So a high body is a brood chamber. It's where the queen's doing some work. A honey super, regardless of the size of the box, is something that the bees are going to store honey in that I'm hoping to harvest at some point during the season. So if you're still putting a high body or aka brood chamber on, continue to feed. Keep that feeder on there. Okay. Safe when honey is being... So are the anti-nosema products safe when honey is to be consumed by humans? They're not to be used during a honey flow. So in other words, but again, if you've got honey supers on, you shouldn't be feeding at that point. So you'd want to feed in advance of your honey supers going on or after you've pulled them off. And there is a delay time there, and I want to say after you stop, you should stop feeding your Fumagillin B in particular. I'm trying to remember the delay. I want to say 14, but I think it might 14 days, but I think it might be longer than that. It says on the label, so check the label. Honey Bee Healthy, you can have it in your feeder. You can pull that feeder off and slap a honey super on. It's all natural essential oils, and so there's no delay. There's no waiting period for that. How much growth in new cells should we be seeing at this time? I installed my new colony with 3 established frames of bees 1 month ago, April 11th. Oh boy, Michael, that's a tough one. Weather, we've had terrible weather here in North Carolina. I'm not sure where you're located. If you've started with 3 frames, you're probably 3 established frames of bees. I installed my... So I guess I need a little clarification. You've installed my new... I installed my new colony. So we're talking a package. I'm assuming a package with 3 established frames of bees. So this was capped brood. You should probably, at this point, you should probably be thinking about adding a second story onto that. They should have those pretty well taken care of, especially if you're feeding. Let's see. Put on the nuke. So this person has a nuke box with a nuke box feeder. No instructions on what order it should be put on the nuke. You can just set that right on top. You've got one of our nuke boxes, so you can set your inner cover. The nuke feeder well, I guess it doesn't matter which one it is. We've got a plastic and a wood. You can put that feeder right on top of the nuke box, then your inner cover, then your outer cover. What about ventilation? Is 95 here in San Antonio. Do I need to provide some ventilation or remove the entrance reducer? So I would probably consider pulling that entrance reducer out at this point. Let them get some ventilation. They need to be evaporating water right now to stay cool. In terms of ventilation, if you've got a screen bottom board, that's going to provide ample ventilation. If you've got one of our inner covers, it's got the notch. Make sure that at the top, make sure that notch is open so they can get airflow going up through and out the top. If you don't have one of our inner covers or an inner cover with a notch, you can put in something like a popsicle stick underneath the inner cover, so between the top box and the inner cover, and that provides just a little bit of a gap to allow for some air to escape out the top, but not big enough that bees can start coming and going and you can get robbing. So you can do that as well. How meticulous should I be when scraping off fur comb when doing an inspection. I like to be fairly meticulous. I carry around a little bucket or a box or, whatever I have handy that's empty to scrape burr comb. I always scrape the top bars. If I split apart different stories, different layers, I'll scrape the comb off the bottom of the frames, the box that was on top, and scrape the wax off the top bars of the box that's below. I'll try and scrape out some of the bridge comb off the sides of the top bars as I'm pulling frames out. If I get a lot of frames out, I'll scrape down the sides of the boxes and maybe a little bit of the rabbet of the box. And the reason for that is, of course, it depends a little bit on my time frame and what I'm doing and weather and things like that. But the more sort of housekeeping you can do at each time you work the hive, the easier it is to work the hive. I've gone to some hives that have been neglected, and they're just buggers to get frames out and move around and work, and they just get messy, and it becomes much harder to deal with. A little bit of maintenance as you go along will carry you a long way. Fantastic egg photo. Thank you. Let's see. Okay, so this person installed 2 packages on the 2nd of May, opened on the 9th, 1 week later, just as they should, found eggs in one. So the queen had already been released probably fairly early. We say a week, but really it only takes a couple of days. But none in the others. Bees seem to be drawing comb, but no eggs. Should I wait another five days or buy a new queen? What I would suggest in this case is at this point we're looking at, it's the 12th. If you can go back in the next day or so, I would check to see whether she's in there or not. Look for those eggs. Maybe, sort of do a search for her. And I would consider getting a replacement for that if you don't see eggs at that point. Because, again, the colony is only going to begin to weaken. I just started. How soon should I check my hive? So if you've installed a package, wait a week to go back to make sure your queen's been released. And then wait another week to go back to make sure she's laying. After that, I generally, for a new colony with new equipment, generally tend to check them about once every 2 weeks or so. How about Megabee? Megabee. Megabee is basically a pollen substitute. This time of year, again, probably not going to benefit you too much. Better off holding off until fall. But I'll tell you what, if you want to call in and place an order, I'll gladly sell it to you. But I would wait, and because I don't think you're going to need it right now. Don't you need to inspect for the virgin queen if she hasn't been out to be bred yet? So most packages, I don't know of any any packaged bee producers that are selling packages with a virgin queen. She should be mated already, which means when she emerges out of her cage, she's more or less ready to hit the ground running or hit the ground laying. So you shouldn't need to inspect for that virgin queen. Now, if you've got cases where the colony's trying to requeen themselves or something like that, then you might want to look for that virgin queen. But frankly, finding a virgin queen can be pretty tough. They're not quite as plump and big as one that's laying. So they blend in even that much more with those workers. Can you use a flashlight? Sure, to get down into the cells? Absolutely. How long is it okay to keep a young hive open while inspecting? Don't the bees get annoyed if you have it open for too long? The longer you keep it open, the more disruptive it will be. So keep that in mind. Generally speaking, I try not to have a hive open for much. A new colony, I try not to have it open for much more than 5 or 10 minutes. Because if it's a new colony, I can basically do my inspections in that amount of time. Even if it's an existing colony, I can do my inspections that quickly. I'm either going in to find eggs to ensure my queen's present, or if it's an existing colony that may be overwintered, I want to check to make sure that that queen has a good egg-laying pattern, a good brood pattern. So in case I'm still looking for eggs, I'm looking for brood. I may be looking for disease. All those things, once you get the hang of it, you can do an inspection fairly quickly. Now that said, you know, I try not to rush. I try to be fairly slow, so you can do it in a few minutes, but keeping it open 10, 15 minutes is okay. I wouldn't keep a new colony open much longer than that. Okay, so this person, 2 weeks since I installed my nuke. Should I be concerned since I waited a week longer? No. Go right on in there and check to make sure you've got some eggs. I don't know where you are, what your weather's like, but you know it's a little bit safer with a nuke because you've got brood there, which is nice. So here. Oh, this is good. I'm gonna paraphrase here in a second. Bear with me as I read through this. Okay. Okay, so this person, here's a tip on locating a queen, but at the end he says that however, seeing eggs and larvae make actually seeing the queen not really necessary. So, but if you do need to find her, and there are times when we do need to find her, he says that he was told, and it seemed in his experience seems to be true, that the queen will be on the dark side of a frame. So I assume, you know, I assume when you say dark side, we're talking about sort of the orientation to the sun. So if the sun is on the left side of the hive, then the queen more often than not is found on the right side of that frame. Also, if you pick up a frame, you can almost be sure she's not on the front side. That might just be a Murphy's Law sort of thing, that if she's not on the front, flip it over quickly and you may find her. Work your way down the super. If you keep doing this, you usually find her. Yeah, it depends. You can also get a sense of if you've got a frame that's plugged up with brood. I don't waste a lot of time looking for her on that frame because there's nowhere for her to lay unless she happens to be crossing that frame to get to another one. I tend to find frames that have open space for her to lay. That's another tip too. But finding her, no doubt, can be a challenge. Oh my God, my bees were stuck in the mail for a week. Is this bad? It's not the end of the world, but this is. I hate to sort of use you as a test case here, but this is why I actually strongly encourage people to try and find local sources because things like this can happen. Now, I assume you've gotten them at this point and you've installed them. And so your queen, and if they had plenty of syrup too, if it was a package of bees, if you noted how much syrup was in the can with them, that would be a good indicator of just how bad or good it may be. If there was plenty of syrup still left, that's a good thing. If it was exhausted, that's a bad thing because they ran out of food. But it's not the end all of end alls. I'm sure they'll do just fine. Looks like, and then put a telescoping cover on. Do I want a special? I'm not sure. This is a rather lengthy question here. So they put their bees in a new hive. It looked like a mountain of bees on top of the frame. So you shook. Okay, so if I'm understanding correctly, you installed a package of bees. I'm sort of making some assumptions here. You installed a package of bees on the by dumping them on the top bars of the box. So you put an empty box on top of the brood box, and then your inner cover and telescoping cover. You need to get some. You want to get frames in that box. You can, because otherwise it'll build comb all over the place. It'll be a mess. So here's what I would do. Go back to that hive with a smoker. Get a good smoke going. Smoke the entrance. Open up the hive. Now you're looking at that empty box. Smoke those bees good and heavy, and what will happen is they'll drop down in. Now that's assuming your queen's been released. You don't want to do this just yet if she hasn't been released. And if she's been released, wait a bit for her to get in there and establish. Go back, smoke them good and heavy. They'll drop down into the box that's got some frames, and then you can, and then if necessary, you can put empty frames into that the medium box that's currently empty. I hope that answers your question. I'm not quite sure of some of the details there. Installed 2 colonies side by side 2 weeks ago. One is doing great. Seems to have at least twice as many bees as the other. Should I shake some bees from the larger hive into the smaller hive? Is the stronger hive downwind of the weaker colony? Just out of curiosity. It could be that you're just getting a little bit of drift because of prevailing wind directions. In which case you might want to space them out just a little bit more so the bees are more apt to go into their colony. A lot of times packages have Italian queens, Italian bees, and they're notorious for drifting. So that might help a little bit. What I would do is I wouldn't necessarily shake bees from the hive. These are new colonies. I would let things go as they are for right now. If you need to, you can take a frame of brood once that's begun in a couple of weeks, and maybe take a frame of brood from the stronger one and put it in the weaker one. But if you take bees and shake them in, you could end up with some fighting, and that could be a bad thing. So I'd let it be for now, let it go, and then if you have to balance it out, you can do it with brood rather than bees. What do you do with a comb that is drawn out unevenly and is detached from the foundation with hollow spots behind it? I scrape it off and I melt it down. For if it's good, it's usually good light wax. I might use it for candles, but you want to make sure they draw on the foundation. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a mess, and it makes it very difficult to work that colony. Scrape it off. Is it going to be recorded? Yes, it is. I have a laying worker. What to do? Laying workers are really difficult to deal with. There's 2 factors that affect whether a laying worker develops. The first is queen pheromone. So if a queen's present, she's producing her odor, her pheromone. That helps suppress the reproductive system of a worker bee, which is essentially what a laying worker is. The reproduction system of a worker bee's become developed for whatever reason, and now she's beginning to lay. So queen pheromone helps suppress that, as well as brood pheromone. So those 2 things. So what you can do, there's a couple of tricks that you can try, but they're all really, it depends on how dedicated you are to trying to save this colony. A lot of people say just unite it with an existing colony and write it off. You can maybe split it back later and put in and install a queen when you split that colony. Another trick that people have tried is taking that colony about 100 feet from its location, literally shaking all the bees out on the ground, and then bringing the equipment back. Your foragers go back to the colony. The laying worker is left on the ground. She doesn't make it back to the colony, and then you can install a new queen. The other thing, so that's another attempt you can try. People have said try installing a virgin queen because her pheromone production isn't as high, so they don't recognize her as a queen, perhaps, and she can slowly move into that position because a laying worker to that colony is just as good as having a queen. So installing a virgin, I've heard, works sometimes. You can also, we've had very good luck with people using the queen requeening frame that we have because you can keep her in that frame for as long as you want, and her pheromone can spread through that colony and slowly suppress the reproductive system of those laying workers again, and then you can release her from that frame and she can take over responsibilities of that colony. And that also helps or what it also helps in that situation is with installing a frame of brood with that queen introduction frame. Because then you're introducing the brood pheromone as well as the queen pheromone to suppress that laying worker. So those are some tips that you can try, but there's really no easy solution, Paul. I'm sorry to say. I fed my bees pop. Is this bad? I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, although I had a call the other day from someone that's feeding a Mountain Dew, or actually it was a customer that was here at the business. I don't recommend that because, again, it's got all sorts of stuff in there that may not be good for the bees. Let's see. So let's see if we see queen cells. Do we destroy them? That's a tough one to answer, because if you're destroying them, you may actually be creating a situation where your colony is going to become hopelessly queenless. In other words, they will not have a queen, and they won't have the ability to requeen themselves. So the answer to that is not an easy one. Here's my rule of thumb, though. I only cut queen cells out. I only destroy them if I know the queen is still present in that colony. So by cutting those cells out, I'm not creating a queenless colony. Or if they've got eggs in that colony in which they can raise new queen cells if necessary. Or if I have a queen that I am putting into that colony. So yes, I had a hive swarm the other day, about a week ago. And so on Sunday, I went through and cut out all the queen cells that were in there because I had a queen to install into that colony. So I cut out all those cells and installed my new queen. So that's sort of my rule of thumb as to whether I destroy those cells. I don't want to create a queenless situation. So I only do it if I know I've got a queen on hand, or I know they've got the ability to raise out a new one if things don't go well. That's not. Let's see. One of my packages has queen cells that you showed, and there does not appear to be a lot of brood. I was not able to locate the queen. Should I allow the colony to produce a new queen or try to purchase another one? I would try to purchase another one, and here's why. If I assume those cells are capped. So let's say, for example, they were capped yesterday. You're looking at 8 days before that new queen emerges, because it takes 8 days for a queen to develop in a capped cell. Then you're looking at about a week or so before she goes off on a mating flight. So we're up to about 2 weeks. Then it's going to take her a while to get back from that mating flight and begin to lay, a few days for that to occur. So you're looking at more than 2 weeks. If you can get a queen in there in the next couple of days, you're saving 2 weeks' time for a package that the average bee lives whoops, I've got some installations that are complete. I don't know if you can see that or not. You've got a package of bees that the colony is going to continue to decline. So the sooner you can get a queen in there and start raising brood, the better off you'll be. The other thing, now you could, Andy, if you've got another colony with brood, you could add brood to this colony and then let it continue, because you're sort of supplementing the population with brood from another colony. Can bees recycle wax? They move wax around. I've had people ask me if they feed their cappings from when they harvest honey to their bees, will they reuse that wax? The answer there is no, but they will move wax around inside a colony. And in fact, the pictures that I showed of the wax foundation, what we found out is that before they even begin to add wax, they actually begin to sculpt the wax that is there. So they'll work with wax to some extent, but they don't really recycle it per se. I've got some older drawn-out frames that have a bit of mold on them. Can I use them? Will the bees clean it up? My rule of thumb here is if the mold takes up less than a quarter of the frame, then I'll consider reusing it in the operation. If the colony raises a superseding queen, will they swarm or stay and make her queen? So I'm assuming they're trying to supersede the queen that came with the package. Generally speaking, they'll either the queen will bump off those queen cells, or the new queen will come out and battle out with the old queen. But they probably, if it's supersedure, they probably will not swarm. Let's see. Do the same for 9-frame high bodies. So 9-frame high bodies, I'm wondering if it's truly a 9-frame high body or if it's 10 frames, but you're only using 9 frames in there. In which case, if it's truly a 10-frame high body, I'm assuming too that we're talking about when to add another story and move those outer frames into position. I lost my train of thought. Oh, so if it's a 10-frame box, and it's new equipment, I would actually use 10 frames in there, because what might happen is that comb, they may build comb sort of randomly off the frames, like people have asked about, where there's sort of hollow spots behind. They may not draw it correctly, so I would use all frames that could fit in that box. Now, if it truly is a 9-frame hive body, then you would wait until about 7 frames were being worked and then jump those 2 outer ones in. Do you put the side being worked on the 2nd frame facing out? Oh, so this is a good question. So let me, can I go back here? So the question is, can I go up? Is it going to let me go up? Yeah. The question is, when I put this frame, when I move this frame to this outer position, do I simply take it as is so that this side of the frame is facing the outside of the box, or will I spin it? And that's a good question. I will actually spin it because that way the bulk of the work is already done and already to the outside. So it just encourages them to build the foundation that much more, or ensures that they'll build it correctly that much more. What are the problems of having a queen excluder on from the beginning? If you've got brand new foundation above it, my experience has been that that queen excluder is a sufficient barrier to prevent them from going up there and actually working those frames. So I let them have free reign of that new equipment for a period of time until they're working it, storing nectar, bringing in pollen maybe laying eggs. Once they've done that, they're sort of trained, if you will, to go up in there, and slipping in an excluder won't be a barrier to them. How many brood boxes are usually used when using 8-frame medium supers? It depends on where you are. Down here, people will use 2 to 3. If you're up north, then I would definitely recommend 3 mediums for the brood chamber. Let's see. Could you talk about adding another layer when you started with drawn comb? So if you started with drawn comb, let's say, for example, I've installed a package and all of these frames were drawn comb. What I would look for at that point is I would wait for probably about 5 or so of these frames to have brood in them. And if that's the case, what's also going to be probably true is that some of these other frames out here will have nectar stored in them because they'll be going out and foraging. At that point is when I would add another story. So once you've got about 5 or so frames of brood down there. Oops. Why not just add the queen excluder at the same time when you add the honey super? Again, if you've got a honey super with drawn comb in it, that is not an issue. But if you've got a honey super with brand new equipment, brand new frames, the bees haven't touched the foundation yet, my experience has been, and I think most people would agree with me on this one, that if you put those new frames above a queen excluder, it's a problem for the bees passing through that excluder onto those new frames. You need to sort of train them to get up there working those frames before that excluder goes into place. Now, let me clarify one point here. Let's say I have a super on there. Let's say I'm ready to add my first honey super. It's brand new frames. I want to put that super on without a queen excluder. Let them go up there and begin working those frames. I can then slip my queen excluder into place. Now it's weeks down the road. I'm ready to add my second honey super, and it too has brand new foundation in it. Now they're already coming through that queen excluder to get into that first super. So I can take that second one with new foundation and put it right on top without having to worry about removing that queen excluder because they're already trained to go through. But my experience has been with new equipment, you're better off leaving it off. You'll be in better position leaving that queen excluder off initially than trying to work with it. And again, if you get a little brood up there, it's not going to be the end of the world. One frame or one medium super, one medium frame holds about 6 pounds. You can get a lot more than that out of a medium super. Could I do a webinar just on using natural methods of disease control? IPM next week. I'm not going to say it's all natural. But IPM basically is using integrated pest management. It's a good start. Let's say that, Paul, and we'll go from there. Do nukes need Fumagillin B? I would probably not. I would wait until fall. New colony, I think the queen is laying, and some burr comb attached to the bottom of the top feeder. Did not see her, but there was a tight ball of bees on the comb. And when I finish my inspection, close up the hive. So this person has a lot of burr comb on the underside of a feeder. Oops, let's see here. I'm just trying to, oops, got a little technical problem here. Just 1 second. I would scrape all that burr comb off and clean it up and make sure the queen is actually laying down on the frames. Okay, So this person's already added an upper deep after the bees had 8 of the 10 frames drawn out on the bottom or were being worked. Can I still move the outer 2 frames in one position? Yes, you can. In the lower box, sure. You can go back down there and bump them in. That's not a problem at all. Let's see. How prevalent is robbing when using inverted perforated container set on top of the inner cover, presumably with an empty box around it? Again, that an internal feeder such as that is less prone to robbing, but just to be on the safe side, I always recommend reducing the entrance when feeding. But an internal feeder such as that, where a bee actually has to go all the way into the hive, all the way through the hive to get up to the feeder, is less prone to robbing than perhaps an entrance feeder. Can you put an entrance reducer on during winter to help with cold and wind? Absolutely, you can. Yep. You just don't. You still want a little bit of ventilation though to vent out moisture. Moisture is the enemy during wintertime. Let's see. Oh my gosh. This person was watching on their laptop and on their back porch and got stung. What they were doing. Must have been those darn yellow jackets. Should one cut out the queen cells to prevent swarming? Again, I defer back to my rule of thumb of I only cut queen cells if I know I'm not going to create a queenless situation, or if I am going to create a potential queenless situation, that I've got a queen available to put into that colony so that I don't go hopelessly queenless. If your colony is not yet swarmed, cutting swarm cells does help reduce the swarming tendency. When starting a new hive, when do you put in a sticky board? When you start a new hive, you can put that sticky board in from day one if you wanted to start monitoring for your mites. Generally speaking, though, with a new colony, with a new package, your mite population is not going to really take off until later on, a couple of months after that colony's been established. So you can wait a little bit, but there's no harm in starting right away. When should one pull the IPM board and have it only be screened? Okay, so in this case, the person's asking when can you pull it out and allow all that ventilation. I would wait until at least you've added your second brood chamber. So then you've got sufficient bees in that colony, sufficient brood going so that they can handle. And by then, too, temperature is probably increasing, and so the ventilation might be good then. How do you control ants from entering your hive? I don't have a good answer, but cinnamon apparently works, which is a natural thing. You can sprinkle it around the ground, but of course after it rains, you've got to reapply. I have heard, and I want to test this year because I had problems with ants last year, and someone told me over winter that if you take a twig from an apple tree and lay it on top of your inner cover, it will discourage ants. Don't know whether it's true or not. I'm looking forward to trying it. What is the brownish stuff in the bottom of some of the cells? Anita, I think I'm going to take a guess. I'm not exactly sure what brownish stuff you're referring to, but I'm going to hazard a guess that I'm going to say pollen. And actually, let me come back over here and is it this sort of brownish stuff? Because this is pollen that's been packed. Of course, the angle's not very good, but this is pollen that's been packed into the cells. What do you do about queen cells in a new package with evidence of laying queen during population decline? I would probably cut those out. So this is your population's declining. They're creating queen cells. That's assuming that you've got a good brood pattern. If it's a spotty brood pattern, they may truly be trying to supersede a bad quality queen. But if it's a fairly good brood pattern and they're trying to raise supersedure cells, I would cut those cells out. You mentioned IPM. What is it? Good question, Pam. IPM stands for Integrated Pest Management. And the short definition, the easiest definition is working with your, in this case, honeybees, and the disease or pests, and working with the natural biology or behavior of your host honeybees and or your disease and pest to try and alleviate the stress of that. So in the case of Varroa, you're working with the natural biology of Varroa mite to try and keep its population low and your bees healthy. So it works with the biology of your host and your disease and pest to try and keep it at bay, or keep it low at least. If a colony is using very little sugar water, how long before it goes bad? Depends. It may last several weeks. If it's sugar water, taste it. If it's a little fermented, maybe not so good for the bees. Otherwise, it's fine. So here's a question from a 7-year-old out there, Grayson. Way to go. We love the young beekeepers. How do you know how old the queen is? The only way to know, to truly know how old a queen is if she is marked. So in other words, the breeder producing that queen marked her with a dot on the back, on her back. And there is a color scheme that is an international standard that each color, there's 5 colors, and they're recycled after 5 years, and they start all over again. There's a color that correlates to each year. So, for example, this year we're 2009. So any year ending with a 9, such as this one, would be a queen raised this year will be marked green. So next year, if you see a queen marked green, you know she's 1 year old. If you see this year, if you see a queen that is marked red, you know she's 1 year old because last year's color was red. So there is an international color scheme that's used to identify the year in which the queen was born, if you will, and so you can determine her age based on that color. But that assumes your queen is marked. If she's not marked, there's no way to know for sure. We're about 4 weeks into our new hive, have not checked for the queen. Should we now, or is it too late? Definitely get in there and check. Let's see. Let's see. I installed 2 5-frame nukes about 3 weeks ago. How long should it be before I see significant changes in the hives, drawing out comb on new frames? You should certainly see it by now, because that, again, nukes continue to grow from day one. So those nukes are only getting stronger. And if you put them into a 10-frame box, they're probably ready at this point for additional stories, I'm guessing. Of course, weather, a lot of factors there. So this person's looking for some clarification. They've got the English garden hive, which is, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's a hive that consists of 8 frame boxes, and they're medium-sized. Okay, so the English garden hive comes with 2 boxes. Both of these I would use for your brood chamber, Tina. So your first one would be for a brood chamber, and the second one that you're putting on there, let's see, it's just getting started pulling out the comb, so you put the second one on there. That too will be their brood chamber. Depending on where you're located, you may want to add a third one for your brood chamber, or that may be sufficient, and the next one you add will be considered your honey super, which, but is this their honey storage for winter? Okay, so the honey that they store for winter will be in their brood chambers, yes, but it will be on the outer frames, the upper corners of frames that may be in the center. So yes, that second one will also contain honey for winter, but it'll also contain some brood. I hope that answers your question. Captured swarm colony the same year. So this person's they captured a swarm, and they're wanting to know, should they requeen that swarm the same year it swarmed? If you can, I probably would, and the reason being that that queen that came with that swarm probably is an older queen, and so it'd be good to get a younger queen into that colony, and also get a colony that you know the genetics of that queen. Let's see here. What sort of other insects, ants, beetles, should we worry about? Mike, it's not an insect, but varroa is a pest you should be concerned about. Ants, ants generally aren't too much of a problem. They may make a mess on the inner cover, on the top of the inner cover, but they usually don't cause too much problems for the bees themselves. Beetles, there is a beetle called small hive beetle that can exploit a colony which is in decline. Not necessarily a package that's naturally declining because the bees are aging and dying off before it grows, but a colony that may be established, but the queen's failing. There may be heavy varroa populations, so they're generally weak. It's the hive beetle's opportunistic generally, as well as wax moth, which is a moth that again is opportunistic. Those would probably be the big ones in terms of small little critters that you need to be concerned about. In winter, should you move honey frames closer to the bees? It couldn't hurt. Let's see. Yeah, just okay. So this person's looking for a little clarification, or I guess a tip. We talked about holding off on the installation of a queen excluder if you're putting new frames, your honey super on with new frames. And the question is, how do you get the queen down and make sure she's not up in that honey super? Generally speaking, if you smoke them pretty good, and give them a little bit of time, right? I mean, if you smoke them and then instantly throw that queen excluder in there, you haven't given that queen enough time to scurry on down into the brood nest. But if you smoke them pretty good, she'll run from that and jump down in between. You can do a quick inspection of those frames to make sure you don't see her. But here's the telltale sign. So you do that, you slip your queen excluder in, and the best way to know if your queen is present is look for eggs, right? So you go back a week after you slip that queen excluder in, and you can pull out some of those frames. If you still see eggs, she's still there, because an egg is only an egg for 3 days before it hatches. So any eggs that she may have laid before you installed the queen excluder will have hatched into larvae. So you may see larvae still, but no eggs if she's downstairs. So that will be a good indicator. Do I leave the entrance reducer in place until the opening gets really congested? I leave the entrance reducer in until it gets really hot more often than not, because then they need the extra ventilation. Congestion isn't necessarily a very good indicator, because especially if you got that 3/4 inch opening, it gets congested pretty easily. When would you use the screened inner cover instead of the solid one? Screened inner covers are really good for high temperatures when you start getting up into the 90s, so that they can get really good ventilation. Or if you're closing your hive up for an extended period of time. For example, my wife and I got married in our backyard. I had to close up the hives. So the bees were confined in that hive. They create a tremendous amount of heat. The extra ventilation with a screened inner cover helps with that. So in those sorts of situations. What'd you say? Okay, so the question is about honey stats. I'll just throw that slide up there so you can, if I can find it, so you can have a look at that. Here we go. So there's, let me scoot that over so I think you should be able to, I think you can see that. Can you see that? I've got a window open here that I'm reading the questions in that may be obscuring. But basically about 6 pounds in a medium, 8 to 10 pounds in a deep frame. These are frames. And you're looking for 60 to 80 pounds for overwintering. Upon catching a swarm, do you recommend using a pollen patty? And if so, how many consecutive times? Greg, you can try it, but again, if there's natural pollen available, they're going to go after that. And chances are, if they're swarming, there's going to be natural pollen available. Let's see here. I'm using a top feeder. It's a mason jar sitting on 2 sticks. Should I add an entrance feeder also? Nope. Just stick with that mason jar. That's just fine. No need in being redundant with your feeding. When should the hive entrance not be reduced anymore? Again, once it starts to get really hot, or when that colony's strong enough to defend itself, which I would say you're looking at about 5 to 6 frames worth of brood. Let's see here. So This person saying, what's the minimum amount of inspection required to keep a hive happy? If it's a new, it depends. If it's an existing colony, this time of year, I'm in them a little bit more frequently. I'm in my overwintered colonies about once a week because the bloom is going, the flow is on so strong that I want to make sure I keep empty supers on there for them to fill up. If it's a colony that I've established, I go in about once every 2 weeks to make sure that they're having their needs met. I have replaced an old frame with a new frame, and the bees have chewed a large hole in the foundation. What is going on? Norman, here's the thing. The bees will draw foundation under the following situations. When they need it, in other words, they need additional space either for brood production or for honey storage or pollen storage. And also, if they've got the resources, the carbohydrates, to produce wax. So in other words, they need to have a food source to be producing the wax as well. So if you're lacking either one of those or any of those, they're gonna not build comb, but rather perhaps move wax around. So I would suggest if it's a new colony, maybe wait until that colony gets a little bit stronger, so they've got the bees available to actually build that comb. Or if you're not feeding feed, those would be sort of where I'd start with that question, and it's sort of a difficult one to answer, but that's where I'd start. Okay, so they've got a new hive, and it's a robbing situation since Sunday. They've reduced the entrance, closed the top entrance as well. Is there anything else I can do? That would be where you can start. There is a thing called a robbing screen, which sort of confuses the robber bees, and that's a possibility. That it moves the entrance to it's sort of hard to explain, but that's a possibility as well. But you can do that. I would stick with that, or possibly add the robbing screen. I was going to suggest something else, but I've changed my mind. Let's see. What type of weather is not good to what type of weather is not good time to go in a hive? Generally, if it's sunny and 50 degrees or better, I'll consider going in a hive. If it's windy and 50, I probably won't because it could chill the brood. But again, it depends on what I'm doing. If I just need to go in real quick for something, I can do it fairly quickly, then I might. But that's sort of my rule of thumb. 50 degrees, sunny, warm, or 50 degrees, sunny, calm winds, or better. Okay, so this person is basically asking about top supering or bottom supering. And let me clarify that. They've got a honey super on, it's full, and now they want to add a second one, and they're wondering if they should take the full one off, put the empty one on, and then restack the full one on top of the empty, so the empty is on the bottom. That's called bottom supering. Or if they should just throw it on top of the full one, which is top supering. I generally always top super unless I've got 3 or 4 supers already on that hive. Then I'll bottom super. But really, once I get that many, I'm thinking about doing an early harvest anyway. And the reason is, frankly, Jennifer, it's easier, and I tend to be short on time. But bottom supering does tend to increase your honey production just a little bit because the bees don't have to go quite as far. If you're really interested in good quality cappings, you'll get better quality cappings because the bees aren't walking across the capped honey in the bottom super to get to the empty super above it, and that's called tracings. So you'll have less tracing on your caps if you take that full one and put it on the top, so they don't have to walk across those cappings. But really, I'd be hard pressed, I think, to tell. Well, maybe not. It's subtle differences with those tracings. So they're feeding, what should they feed? 1-to-1 sugar to water ratio. 1 part sugar to 1 part water. It doesn't matter whether it's by weight or volume. The bees are not that fussy. Concerned about a wild hive robbing nearby. Again, just reduce that entrance and you should be fine. Queen came across in a new package or new. Okay, so they're looking for a little clarification. They've got evidence of a laying queen. If you came across cat supersedure cells in a new package or nuke, would you cut them or cut them out, or assume they were there for a legit reason for them to build those cells? I would sort of base that on the pattern of brood that I was seeing. If it was a good quality pattern of good worker, not drones, but it's a good uniform pattern of worker brood, I would consider cutting them out. If it was a spotty brood pattern, I would consider that they're there for a legit reason. Time frame we must in capturing. Okay, so this person's trying to capture bees from a bee tree, and they want to know what the time frame in introducing a queen into the captured bee to successfully establish a new colony. I would, as soon as you move the bees, your trap, however you're trapping them, away from the bee tree is when I would install that new queen. In a cage, of course, so that there's a slow introduction. Do we need to worry about treating for mites if we don't see any evidence of mites? Chances are you will see evidence of mites. And so you'll need to take some sort of action. They're all throughout the U.S. They're all throughout the world, with a few exceptions. Okay. Let's see. Scrolling down. Should I think I've already answered the question about feeding the syrup in terms of how long and when should you feed something besides syrup. You might consider a patty in the fall to give them some protein so that when they begin raising brood in spring, it's present. But generally speaking, my experience has been that there's sufficient pollen stores to get them started. So I usually feed pollen patties first thing in spring. Is there any way to tell the difference between a frame filled with sugar water from one filled with honey? Taste would be the easiest thing. You'll definitely be able to taste it. But visually, well, I guess if you extract it, you might be able to see a visual difference as well. Are there any problems with starting new packages on all small cell foundation? Yes, there can be. You have to regress the bees. You've got to, because most, well, I should clarify, most packages that you find commercially will be bees that were not raised on small cells, so they're going to be larger, especially the queen, and so the bees will not, they will actually make the cells big to accommodate the big bees. So you have to do what we call regress them, and that's a little bit that's a little lengthy to try and explain here. Are there people in the north that use all medium-high bodies? They're in upstate New York. I lived in the foothills of the Adirondacks and kept a few colonies in all mediums and worked out just fine. Let's see here. of using 2 deeps rather than 1 deep near Savannah, Georgia. 1 deep, you can use 1 deep, but it for me, it just doesn't give them quite enough space, and you may have problems with swarming. There may be some folks down there that disagree with me on that, and a lot depends on your management, but I think they just need a little bit more brood space than that. So what time of year might I consider feeding pollen patties? I generally feed them first thing in the spring, like in February, March. When the queen is really starting to produce lay eggs, and they may need the protein for feeding the developing brood. Thought I already answered. Let's see here. So let's see. Full sun, actually, this person's here in North Carolina. We know that hives generally are healthier when in full sun. But Greensboro, it can get pretty hot there. A little light shade wouldn't be bad, but not, I wouldn't stress too much about it. So this person's using all medium boxes. And are there any disadvantages to this? I actually like that configuration. I think that it makes managing a colony and rotating equipment fairly easy, and so it's a good thing. And I'm sure there are some disadvantages. There's always disadvantages to everything out there, but I can't think of any off the top of my head right now. Any preference in introducing it to a hive right away or next day of leaving? Hold on, I'm trying to, any preference to introducing a new colony to hive right away or the next day, leaving them at a hive location for 24 hours in a nuke box? And is it preferred to... So, I guess they've got a nuke, and it's at a location, and they're wondering about moving it getting it into the hive. So if it's physically way away, there's no harm. You can do that. You can let them sit there for 24 hours if you've just picked up this nuke. But you want to get it into a colony fairly quickly, depending on the provider of the nuke. It could be a really good nuke, in which case it's difficult sometimes. I've sold nukes in the past, and it's sort of a double-edged sword. You want to give the customer a good, strong nuke, but a good, strong nuke may also be starting to think about swarming. So you don't want to leave them in that nuke box too long. You want to get them into a hive. So if it's far away, you can do that tomorrow. That's fine. If it's right nearby, what I do is I set up the empty hive right next to the nuke box, and you can just move those frames in. In terms of time of day, definitely do it midday. Don't wait until night, because you've got to open up that nuke. Bees will start walking if it's dark, and they'll find every little nook and cranny to get into if they're walking around. So, do it during daylight hours, and then you can just take away the nuke box, and they'll be in that colony. And any bees coming back will enter right into that new colony. Let's see. And I've already talked a little bit about ants and earwigs. Earwigs freak me out. And they're all over my inner covers. Every time I go into the hive, I shake them off. I go back. They're there again. The bees chase them around a little bit. It's one of those pests that they sort of freak us out more than it does the bees. So I wouldn't worry too much about earwigs. Anybody who's a non-beekeeper would probably say, you work with stinging insects and earwigs freak you out? Let's see here. So this person's got 2 strong hives, 2 weak hives. They've used top feeders. and there's some dead bees in those top feeders. If it's the wooden top feeders, the floats they do reduce the drowning. The number of bees you're mentioning, I would not be concerned about. Open feeder like that, inevitably you will get some drowning. If it's the brown plastic top feeder and they're drowning in there, they're coming in from the outside. I don't think that that there's a correlation between the strength of the hive and the type of feeder. I don't think that the bees drowning in those feeders have somehow weakened the colony. Do I remove burr comb, especially once there are 2 deeps? It takes quite a while to do a full inspection. Yeah, you can sort of just do it as you go along, if possible. It'll save you time in the long run. And if the temperature's over 70 degrees, is there a recommended time limit for the inspection? I rarely let an inspection go more than a half hour because the bees start to get agitated. 2 frames of honey, the queen was released. Hold on, this is, whoops, I think okay. So this person did a split, installed a new queen, has some sugar water going, the queen's been released, but they've got some robbing, and the entrance is reduced. I'm sort of surprised. If I remember correctly, Samuel, you're up in Massachusetts, is that right? I'm sort of surprised this time of year that you're getting some robbing up there because there's usually a pretty good flow going on. But then again, I have heard reports that it's sort of cool and damp up there. So keep the entrance reduced. If you've got the ability to maybe move the, here's what I would do. You've got that split. You can pile up. You can move that hive away a little bit. You're split away. Pile up some brush in front of it, and that makes it harder for bees to get through that brush. Any bees that may be a little bit disoriented by the fact that you've moved it away will be forced into reorienting by the brush, and that might help reduce your robbing tendency. That's what I would do if you've got that ability. Yeah, the black screen was just the end of my slide show. Oh, how do I know if robbing is occurring when the hive is open? You'll know it. It's really quite a spectacle. So a queen excluder is not included in a beginner's kit. Is it mandatory? Is it necessary your first year? Is it mandatory in a hive? We don't include a queen excluder in our beginner's kit because 50% of the beekeepers out there love them. The other 50% call them honey excluders. So we don't include them for that reason. It's a personal preference. Me personally, I like them because it keeps my brood chamber separate from my honey supers. I think I get a little bit cleaner honey, so I like to use them, but it's not mandatory by any stretch. It's not necessary at any point in time. It's just sort of a personal preference. So this person was wondering about spraying fumagillin. So they mix a little fumagillin in with their sugar water sprayer when they mist down their package. That's actually a nice little tip. But they didn't do that, so they're wondering what they should do. Installed them the first week of May. At this point, I would probably, if you're feeding them, you can mix a little in with the syrup. Otherwise, I would just wait until fall. Brood boxes. Okay. So this, okay. So they had an overwintered colony. They went to reverse the brood chambers, noticed a lot of bird comb and drone. That's fairly common. I actually will inspect that drone because mites prefer drone over workers, so I can get a sense of what my mite population is. And they've added a third. Let's see, I sort of had to skip down here a little bit. So on top of providing laying room for the queen, hoping to split the hive at the end of the month. Depending on what size boxes these are, I don't see that. 3 mediums wouldn't be a problem. 3 deeps would be an awful big hive. And I suspect that bottom box is not going to have a whole lot of brood or in it or bees because they're going to want to move up. So what you may find is that you just need those 2 top boxes, and that third one you can do away with, depending on the strength of the colony. But splitting them, what I've done with splits is wait for the two brood boxes to be fairly brooded up, and I'll just take one without the queen and pull it off of the hive and use that as my split. So you can do that as well. That's a reasonable solution, yes. Let's see here. Can sugar water be used instead of smoking the bees? Yes, you can. I guess I'm a little old-fashioned. I still like to have my smoker going. Why use corn syrup? Convenience of mixing, diluting large volumes. It's just easy. Corn syrups. We're not talking corn syrup that you buy at the grocery store. We're talking food grade corn syrup that they use in soda and things like that. Not necessarily soda, but it's a food grade corn syrup. The stuff at the grocery store is very expensive for a fairly small amount, but it's a convenience thing. You can feed it as is. You can dilute it, and there's lots of commercial and hobby beekeepers out there using it. If you want to mix your own syrup, spring it's a 1-to-1 ratio of sugar to water. In the fall, it's 2 sugar to 1 water. It's all over the queen. So this person installed a new package and a cage. Once the queen is out, should you remove the cage because they're producing comb on it? Yeah, once the queen's been released, you can pull that queen cage out. There's no use in having it in the colony anymore. Okay. So this person took a frame of brood and the queen out of a colony to start an observation hive. Was hoping that the colony in which that queen came from was going to raise out a new queen, but they have not. They want to know if they can just put the frame of with the queen back in that hive. No, because her pheromones sufficient. They've sort of forgotten about her, so they won't necessarily recognize her as their own at this point. So you can't simply put it back in there. Yeah, that would be the better way. So put her in a queen cage and reintroduce her gradually. That's exactly what I would do. Let's see. How do you get a good mix of drones to mate with a queen raised from queen cells? Won't she mate with drones from her own hive? No, she goes on a mating flight. So she leaves the colony and goes to a drone congregation area where literally there could be thousands and thousands of drones from all across the area, and she'll mate with those. There's no way to ensure that she has a good mating, but unless you can try and saturate the area with drones by producing drone colonies, which is what queen breeders do. But generally speaking, there's no way to ensure, unless you artificially inseminate her, that she'll have a good mating. You just sort of cross your fingers a bit. When you say move a brood frame to another hive to strengthen it, do you also take the bees that are on the frame as long as the queen is not on the frame? It depends on just how weak that colony is. Here's an example. The woman working in our showroom had a weak colony. The queen had a spotty brood pattern, but it was early in spring, and so in that case, I said, well, there's not enough bees to tend to the brood. So what happens is she lays up an area, it gets cold, that area of brood dies because there aren't enough bees to tend to it. So in that case, we took a frame of brood with bees from a strong colony, misted everything down with sugar water, and installed it directly into that colony. So we had brood and now more bees to tend to that brood. And she says that colony, this was about 2 months ago, that colony's taken off now. So that's a case where I'd bring the bees with them. This time of year, I would where temperatures are a little warmer, I would probably shake the bees off and just bring the frame of brood. This person wants to use linseed oil to treat their hives. Do they use boiled or raw? You're only going to do the outside. You're not going to do the inside. And I would use boiled because the raw linseed will stay wet and tacky for a really long time. Let's see here. What do you do with drone brood, bullet type appearance? Destroy it? How? Bees are naturally going to produce, a colony of bees will naturally produce about 10% drone, so you'll never be able to get rid of it completely. What happens is if they're using a frame where worker brood once existed to raise out drone, it sort of creates that patch of drone comb. Once those patches get too large, I'll call that frame as part of my management. You can, if you're using plastic foundation, scrape out that portion and let them rebuild cells there and hope that they rebuild worker cells or cells to store honey. You can use a drone frame, which we'll talk about in IPM next week, to sort of control where they build that comb, and that helps a little bit too. Okay. So this person is using a 10-frame super that has 9-frame spacers in it. They opened up the hive and noticed that basically they're building comb in between the frames, as I understand it. And they've also got honey stored in those. Is there a way to keep this from happening? I'm assuming that these are brand new frames, and whenever I start a honey super with brand new frames, I always start it with a full number of frames for this reason, because I can pack them together. Once frames are drawn, you can put 9 in there, and you'll actually get more honey from that super than if you had 10 frames in there, because they can draw the cells out a little further. If it's new comb and those spacers, that's the problem. Those spacers is it forces you to have them spaced out that way. If you've got a box that doesn't have those spacers that you can put 10 frames in, and then once they had them drawn out, you can move them back to that box that had the spacer. But outside of that, Cindy, I'm just not sure of a good way to get around it, other than getting 10 frames into that super if they're new frames. Is there a problem with ants being near the hive? Generally speaking, no. In Minnesota, would you use a screen or a bottom board? Again, most of you know, I lived up in New York State in the foothills of the Adirondacks, and I use screens on my hives on the bottom for ventilation. So there's no problem there. When using a hive top feeder, should you use a queen excluder to keep the queen out of the feeder? Generally speaking, she's not going to want to mess with that. She doesn't feed herself. The bees feed her, so she's got no business going up there anyway. So I wouldn't worry about putting on a queen excluder. Okay, so here's an answer to the ants. They had ants. They had a stand that was about 8 to 10 inches tall with flat feet that they placed in cut-off quart milk jugs and put vegetable oil, small amounts, so that what happened is when the ants, to get onto the hive stand, they had to basically try and swim through the vegetable oil, which ants aren't very good at doing. So that helped control their ants. It's a very good suggestion. Looking at your queen slide, is that wax or propolis in closing in the? It was wax that was forming the cell cup. Oh, I think what you're seeing there. Let me go back. I think there in the background, what you see is this cell right here actually has a little bit of pollen in it, so you're sort of seeing that bleeding through the bottom of the cell. I think that's what you're referring to. Any need to pick drone bees out of a hive, inner hive feeder? I would get them out if you can. I mean, you don't have to go to extremes to keep them bee free, but you know, it's good just to keep them out if possible. So screen bottom boards, should we cover it up during winter or leave it open? I've left mine open all winter long and had bees overwinter just fine. But generally speaking, it's not, well, you can leave it open. You just, if it's high off the ground, you'd want to close it off a little bit so you don't get large drafts going up there. If it's closer to the ground, you could probably leave it open. Are there any tricks to requeening? How difficult is it? First and most important is you've got to kill off the old queen. The next thing is install your new queen at the same time. So you find your old queen, you kill her, you have to kill her. I'm sorry, you've got to kill her. Take her and throw her far, far away from the hives, and then install your new queen right away. Some things that can help: if you're comfortable releasing the attendants from the queen cage so that only the queen remains in the queen cage, you will get a little bit better acceptance rates than if those attendants are present. So that's the other thing. Outside of that, the hardest part is finding that old queen, but you've got to do it. Is covering that. So this person, they live near a field that's sprayed with pesticides, is covering the hive with a sheet enough. I would try and work with that farmer to see if you can't get them to spray in the evening hours after a lot of the foragers have come back to the hive. That will be your best bet. Try and position your hives so that they're not downwind, so any overspray doesn't sort of drift into the hives. But legally speaking, that farmer could, well, I'm no lawyer, I'm not going to say. I would talk to the grower. Okay. 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 I think hopefully we're getting to the end here. I'm getting woozy. Do I recommend Drone Cell Foundation for controlling Varroa? Yes, we'll talk about that next week. So they've got chalk brood in their hive. Do you know how we should get rid of it? Chalk brood, there's no treatment for it. You can try and requeen it. There is some genetic link. Certain bees are more likely to have chalk brood. Generally speaking, chalk brood in springtime, I'm not surprised. Chalk brood's a stress-induced disease. It's a fungus. So springtime, there's usually a lot of moisture, which is good for fungus. It's often a stressful time for a colony, which leads to cases of chalk brood. Generally speaking, it will clear itself up, but requeening is probably your best option in trying to mitigate it. Okay, thank you, Thomas. Let's see here. Is 3 medium 8-frame boxes too much space, the right amount for a strong hive before adding honey supers? I would say that's probably, again, depending on where you are, I usually don't go any more than that. Oops. So can I elaborate on how to split a hive and how to recognize when it's time to split that hive? Well, if you're trying to do it for a swarm control measure, that's one thing. But, in terms of time to split a hive, it's more the condition of the hive that would dictate that. Generally speaking, I want to be able to take, if I'm moving the split directly into a hive body as opposed to a nuke box, I want to be able to take about 4 to 5 frames worth of brood out of that colony, which means I want to leave at least 4 to 5 frames of brood, or rather 5 to 6 frames of brood in that parent colony as well. So that's sort of what you're looking for. And outside of that, you can do it at just about any time. There's a couple of things that you can do. You can take a couple of frames and move it into a 5-frame nuke box, in which case you don't need to take as many bees, and grow that nuke. You can do it that way. You can, the way that I've done things in the past is if I've got 2 brood chambers, I'll throw a queen excluder between them, go back a week later, look for eggs. The one that's got the eggs I know has the queen. The one that doesn't, I know doesn't have the queen. And so I'll take the brood chamber that doesn't have the eggs and move that to my new location and install the queen. And that's it. I'm done. Now I treat it as if I'm starting a new colony. So I'll go back a week later and make sure she's been released. Outside of quite a bit more elaborate conversation, that's sort of the long and the short, if you will. Let's see. So they've got 1/4 to a 1/2 inch long worm on the IPM bottom board. What are they and what should we do about them? They're pale in color. A 1/2 inch, you're probably looking at wax moth, which that's where you'd want them. You'd want them down there. If you saw them in the hive, that would be problematic. As long as they stay down there, I wouldn't worry too terribly much about them. So when you say IPM board, I'm assuming it's sort of that sheet that's underneath the screening where the bees do not go, which means the bees have sort of chased them off down there or chased the worms down there. So when you start to see them in the hive, that I'd be concerned about it. I would just clean them off and just keep an eye on it. Make sure that and also inspect your hive. Make sure you got a good brood pattern. Your queen's present. Maybe inspect for varroa to make sure you don't have a heavy infestation, so that those wax moth aren't trying to exploit a declining colony. I need to spray around poison ivy around the hives. Is this a problem? You're spraying the poison ivy. First off, poison ivy does bloom and bees love it. I would, if possible, wait for that bloom to end, which usually is about a week after it starts, and then spray that poison ivy in the evening hours once all the bees have returned to the hive. The spray dries on the foliage pretty quickly and shouldn't be a problem, and the bees won't be foraging on it then either. So that's what I would suggest. All right, woo! We've made it to the end. So next week is IPM. Thank you all for attending, and we'll hopefully see y'all, or you can come back next week and listen to me drone on for, no pun intended, drone on for another session. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening, and good luck out there. Bye-bye.